Chosen one, listen carefully. This message isn't an accident. God is preparing something you never saw coming. There is something deeply human about believing that the most important people in our lives will arrive with unmistakable certainty. We imagine that destiny announces itself with dramatic signs, overwhelming emotion, or extraordinary circumstances. Yet Scripture and history suggest something far more surprising. God rarely reveals his greatest works through spectacle. More often, he hides the extraordinary inside what appears to be perfectly ordinary. The people who reshape our lives frequently enter through the quiet door of an ordinary day, and only later do we realize heaven had been guiding every step. So before tomorrow becomes just another page on your calendar, consider this possibility. The person God has been preparing for your future may already be closer than you think. Not because fate is playing games with your emotions, but because providence has always worked beyond the limits of human perception. While you have been wondering whether anything is changing, God has been arranging circumstances that your eyes cannot yet see. When I say someone is coming, I do not mean this in the shallow sense of romance alone. I mean that God often sends people whose presence becomes part of his answer to our prayers. Throughout Scripture, lives changed because God introduced one prepared heart to another at precisely the right moment. These meetings appeared ordinary on the surface, yet they carried eternal significance because heaven had written the encounter long before either person understood its purpose. This is one of the greatest mysteries of faith. We judge our lives by what is visible today, while God is working through realities that remain hidden. We assume nothing is happening because nothing dramatic has appeared, yet beneath the surface, countless details are already moving into place. Like the roots of a mighty tree stretching silently through the soil before its branches ever reach the light, God's preparations almost always begin where human eyes cannot observe them. Psychologically, this reveals something profound about the human heart. We are remarkably skilled at remembering disappointment, but surprisingly poor at recognizing quiet progress. Yesterday's heartbreak convinces us tomorrow will repeat the same story. Past betrayals teach us to expect distance instead of devotion. Loneliness persuades us that meaningful connection belongs to someone else. We mistake fear for wisdom simply because fear has become familiar. Faith interrupts that pattern. Faith does not ignore reality, it expands it. It reminds us that God's activity is not limited to what we can currently measure. C.S. Lewis often observed that our deepest desires point beyond themselves, suggesting we were made for something greater than immediate experience. Perhaps your longing for genuine companionship is not evidence that something is missing forever. Perhaps it is evidence that God has been preparing your heart to recognize a gift that could not have been appreciated in an earlier season. This is why spiritual awareness matters so deeply. Many people pray for God's answers while overlooking the quiet ways those answers begin to appear. They expect thunder, but ignore the gentle knock. They search for unmistakable signs while overlooking ordinary conversations that heaven has already filled with purpose. Divine appointments rarely demand attention. They quietly invite it. So if this message has reached you today, do not dismiss tomorrow as merely another ordinary day. Walk into it with open eyes, a peaceful spirit, and a heart that remains awake to God's quiet leading. The man God is preparing may not arrive with dramatic announcements or impossible miracles. He may simply step into your life at the exact moment heaven has appointed. And only afterward will you discover that what appeared ordinary was, in fact, the beginning of one of God's most remarkable works. One of the hardest truths for the human heart to accept is that love delayed is not always love denied. We live in a culture that celebrates immediacy. If something can happen today, we wonder why it should wait until tomorrow. We have become accustomed to instant communication, instant information, and instant gratification. It is no surprise then that we often expect God to work according to the same timetable. Yet one of the defining characteristics of divine wisdom is that it refuses to be rushed. God measures time differently because he is concerned not only with what he gives us, but with who we become before we receive it. This is why some people remain hidden from our lives far longer than we expected. It is not because heaven has forgotten us. It is because heaven understands something we cannot yet see. A relationship that arrives before two souls are prepared can become a source of pain instead of peace. The greatest gift, delivered in the wrong season, can become a burden. God, in his wisdom, often protects us from receiving too much too soon. Think about how nature itself reflects this principle. A seed buried beneath the soil appears inactive. To the casual observer, nothing is happening. Days pass, weeks pass, and the ground remains unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, an invisible transformation is taking place. Roots are forming before leaves ever appear. Strength develops before beauty becomes visible. If someone impatiently dug up that seed every few days to check its progress, they would destroy the very growth they hoped to see. In much the same way, impatience often tempts us to interfere with the quiet work God is accomplishing in unseen places. The same is true of the people he prepares for us. Perhaps the man God intends to bring into your life is learning lessons he could not have learned any other way. Perhaps he is overcoming fears that once controlled him. Perhaps he is recovering from disappointments that would have prevented him from loving faithfully. Character is rarely built in moments of comfort. It is forged through seasons of testing, humility, and surrender. While you have been asking God, "Where is he?" heaven may have been asking, "Will you trust me while I finish what I have started?" But this preparation is never one-sided. It is remarkably easy to imagine that someone else needs to change before our prayers can be answered. Yet faith invites us to examine ourselves with the same honesty. Are we becoming the kind of person who can recognize a healthy relationship when it arrives? Have we learned to distinguish genuine peace from emotional excitement? Have we healed from the wounds that tempt us to confuse attention with affection? These questions are not meant to condemn us. They are invitations to grow. Psychology offers an insight that beautifully aligns with this spiritual reality. Human beings often recreate familiar emotional patterns without realizing it. Someone who has experienced repeated rejection may unconsciously gravitate toward relationships that feel familiar rather than relationships that are healthy. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar peace simply because it is known. We mistake intensity for intimacy and uncertainty for romance because our emotions have been trained by our past instead of transformed by truth. Faith challenges those instincts. It teaches us that healing is not simply forgetting yesterday's wounds, but allowing God to reshape the way we interpret tomorrow's opportunities. As our hearts become healthier, our ability to recognize healthy people grows as well. Suddenly, what once seemed attractive no longer satisfies, and qualities we previously overlooked begin to matter deeply. Patience becomes more valuable than charm. Integrity becomes more beautiful than appearance. Consistency becomes more attractive than empty promises. This is often the quiet miracle that occurs before God brings two lives together. He changes what each person desires before he changes where they meet. There is another reason God keeps certain people hidden: protection. We often think protection means being rescued from obvious danger, but sometimes protection means being spared from unnecessary timing. Imagine meeting someone destined to become deeply important in your life while one of you was still carrying unresolved bitterness, pride, or fear. The connection might have ended before it ever had the opportunity to flourish. What looked like a missed opportunity may actually have been divine mercy. Scripture repeatedly reminds us that God's timing is never random. Throughout the Bible, people waited through seasons that seemed unbearably long, only to discover later that every delay had prepared them for something far greater than they could have imagined. Looking backward, the waiting made sense. Looking forward, it felt almost unbearable. That is the paradox of faith. Understanding usually follows obedience, not the other way around. So if you find yourself wondering why this person has not yet appeared, resist the temptation to conclude that nothing is happening. Hidden does not mean absent. Silence does not mean abandonment. Delay does not mean denial. It may simply mean that two stories are still being written before they become one. The man God is preparing does not need to be chased, manipulated, or forced into your path. If he is truly part of God's purpose for your life, then the same God who is shaping your heart is also shaping his. And when the appointed season finally arrives, you may discover that what felt like years of waiting was actually years of preparation. Only then will you understand that heaven was never withholding a blessing. It was making sure that when it arrived, both of you were finally ready to receive it. One of the questions people ask most often is, how will I know when God is about to do something significant? It is an understandable question because the human mind longs for certainty. We search for unmistakable signs, dramatic confirmations, or extraordinary experiences that remove every trace of doubt. Yet, if we pay close attention to the way God has often worked throughout history, we notice a surprising pattern. Before he changes our circumstances, he frequently begins by changing us. The first evidence of a new season is rarely found in the world around us. It appears quietly within the landscape of our own hearts. This is one of the great paradoxes of spiritual life. We spend so much energy watching for external events that we overlook the internal transformation already taking place. We ask God to show us what is coming, while he is patiently preparing us to become the kind of people who can receive it wisely. Think about dawn for a moment. The sun does not suddenly leap into the sky. Long before it becomes visible above the horizon, darkness begins to lose its strength. The air changes. The colors shift almost imperceptibly. The world is still quiet, yet everything is moving toward morning. In much the same way, God often announces a new season through subtle changes that only a spiritually attentive heart can recognize. Perhaps you have noticed that old wounds no longer control your thoughts the way they once did. Memories that once filled you with bitterness now produce compassion instead of resentment. Conversations that once left you emotionally exhausted no longer have the same power over your peace. You may not think much of these changes because they seem ordinary, but they are anything but ordinary. They are signs that your heart is becoming freer than it was yesterday. Psychologically, this makes perfect sense. Healing is rarely dramatic. It is usually so gradual that we only recognize it when we compare who we are today with who we used to be. We often expect transformation to feel like an explosion, but more often it resembles the quiet turning of seasons. Trees do not hear themselves growing, yet every year they stand taller than before. Likewise, the soul often matures in silence. This is important because the relationships God blesses are built upon the health of two growing hearts rather than the excitement of two impulsive emotions. Another hidden sign is the increasing clarity of your priorities. There was a time when you may have prayed simply for someone to love you. Now your prayers have become deeper. You ask for wisdom instead of excitement, peace instead of constant emotional highs, character instead of appearances. This shift is significant because it reveals that your desires are becoming aligned with God's wisdom rather than merely your immediate feelings. C.S. Lewis often suggested that our desires require education just as much as our minds do. Left to themselves, our emotions chase whatever promises immediate satisfaction. But faith teaches us to desire what is truly good, rather than merely what is temporarily attractive. This quiet reordering of the heart is one of God's greatest miracles, because it prepares us to recognize blessings that our former selves might have ignored. You may also notice that certain doors are closing without your effort. Relationships that once consumed your attention begin to fade naturally. Opportunities that seemed essential no longer feel necessary. At first, these endings can feel confusing, even painful. We are tempted to interpret every closed door as a loss. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that God often clears the path before he reveals the destination. Imagine trying to plant a garden in soil already crowded with weeds. Before anything beautiful can grow, something else must first be removed. What feels like subtraction is often preparation. God is making room for what belongs by gently removing what does not. Another sign is an unexpected sense of peace that cannot be explained by your circumstances. This peace does not mean life suddenly becomes easy. Difficulties may still exist. Questions may remain unanswered. Yet beneath those uncertainties, there is a growing confidence that your life is not drifting aimlessly. You begin to trust that even delays have purpose. This quiet assurance is one of the most profound gifts of faith because it frees you from the exhausting need to control every outcome. It is remarkable how often people mistake anxiety for responsibility. They believe that constant worrying somehow protects them from disappointment. In reality, anxiety usually narrows our vision. It convinces us that every unanswered question is a threat instead of an invitation to trust. Peace, on the other hand, expands our perspective. It reminds us that God's wisdom extends far beyond the limits of our understanding. Perhaps the most overlooked sign is a renewed sensitivity to ordinary moments. Suddenly, you become more attentive to the people around you. You listen more carefully. You notice opportunities to encourage others. Your daily routines no longer feel empty because you begin to suspect that God often hides extraordinary purposes inside ordinary encounters. This is exactly how providence works. Divine appointments rarely interrupt life. They are woven into it. The conversation you almost cancelled, the place you nearly decided not to visit, the introduction that seemed insignificant. These ordinary moments have often become the turning points people only recognize in hindsight. None of these signs guarantee that tomorrow will unfold exactly as you imagine. Faith is not about predicting the future with certainty. It is about living with open eyes, expecting that God is active even when his methods remain hidden. So if you sense that your heart is changing, your priorities are becoming clearer, your peace is growing stronger, and your attention is becoming more focused on what truly matters, do not dismiss these changes as coincidence. They may be heaven's quiet announcement that a new chapter is drawing near. And when the man God has been preparing finally steps into your life, you may realize that the clearest sign of his arrival was never found in him first. It was found in the person God was transforming you to become. If there is one force that quietly opposes almost every blessing God intends to bring into our lives, it is fear. Not the kind of fear that protects us from genuine danger, but the subtler fear that disguises itself as wisdom. It whispers, "Don't hope too much. Don't trust too deeply. Don't expect anything different because you'll only be disappointed again." At first, these thoughts seem reasonable. They sound cautious, even mature, but beneath their calm appearance lies a dangerous assumption that the future must always repeat the failures of the past. This is one of fear's greatest deceptions. It convinces us that experience alone should define expectation. If you have been hurt before, fear insists you will be hurt again. If someone once betrayed your trust, fear quietly persuades you that trust itself is the problem. If relationships have ended in disappointment, fear teaches you to protect your heart by expecting the worst. Yet there is a profound difference between learning from yesterday and becoming imprisoned by it. Faith does not ask us to forget our experiences. It asks us to refuse the conclusion that yesterday has authority over tomorrow. Throughout Scripture, moments of divine breakthrough were almost always preceded by seasons of uncertainty. Before new beginnings came long periods of waiting. Before promises were fulfilled, there were questions that seemed impossible to answer. It is almost as though God allows our confidence in ourselves to weaken so that our confidence in Him can become stronger. This does not mean He enjoys our struggles. Rather, He understands that trust cannot grow where absolute certainty already exists. Consider how often the greatest transformations in life begin with discomfort. A child takes first steps by risking a fall. A seed becomes a tree only after breaking apart beneath the soil. Even gold becomes pure only after passing through intense heat. Growth and discomfort have always shared the same story. We naturally wish for one without the other, but wisdom teaches us that the two often walk together. Psychology offers an insight that beautifully echoes this truth. The human brain is designed to remember painful experiences more vividly than pleasant ones. This tendency once helped our ancestors survive physical dangers, but in emotional life it often becomes a prison. One betrayal can overshadow years of kindness. One heartbreak can convince us that love itself is unsafe. Without realizing it, we begin filtering every new opportunity through the lens of old wounds. This is why fear feels so convincing. It borrows evidence from the past while pretending to predict the future. But fear has one weakness: it cannot imagine what God is capable of doing next. The Lord is not limited by the patterns that limit us. He is not trapped by the statistics we quote or the disappointments we remember. He has always delighted in bringing unexpected life where people assumed nothing good could possibly happen. The Bible is filled with stories of barren seasons giving way to abundance, broken lives becoming testimonies, and impossible situations turning into evidence of divine faithfulness. These accounts are not merely ancient history. They reveal something about God's character. He specializes in working beyond the boundaries that fear declares permanent. Perhaps this is why the closer people come to genuine healing, the louder fear often becomes. Have you ever noticed that just as you begin to regain hope, an old memory suddenly returns? Just as you start believing the future could be different, doubt begins whispering that you are making a mistake. This is not proof that you are moving in the wrong direction. More often, it is evidence that something inside you is changing, and fear is resisting the transformation. The remarkable thing about fear is that it rarely commands. It suggests. It offers small compromises that seem harmless. Don't answer that message. Don't open your heart. Don't believe this could be different. Over time, those small suggestions build invisible walls around the soul. Eventually, we are no longer protecting our hearts. We are isolating them. Faith tears down those walls, not by pretending risk no longer exists, but by reminding us that God's guidance is greater than our uncertainty. This becomes especially important when we consider the person God may be preparing to bring into your life. Imagine if fear convinced you to reject genuine kindness simply because it looked unfamiliar. Imagine mistaking peace for boredom because you had become accustomed to emotional chaos. Imagine walking away from someone of integrity because they did not resemble the people who once captured your attention. Fear does not always keep blessings away. Sometimes it blinds us to them when they are standing directly before us. That is why discernment matters more than suspicion. Discernment listens to God's wisdom.
Suspicion listens only to yesterday's pain.
Discernment brings peace, even when decisions are difficult. Suspicion creates endless anxiety because it assumes danger is always hiding nearby. As C.S. Lewis often suggested, courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something greater is worth trusting. Faith works in much the same way. It does not eliminate uncertainty, it places uncertainty into the hands of a trustworthy God. The future will always contain questions, but those questions no longer have the power to rule us. So if you find fear becoming unusually loud, do not immediately assume something is wrong. Instead, ask yourself whether it is possible that you are standing closer to a new season than you realize. The enemy of your soul has always preferred discouragement over confrontation because discouraged people often surrender before the blessing ever arrives. Do not allow fear to become the author of your future. Let faith hold the pen. The God who has guided you through every previous chapter has not abandoned the story now. He is still writing. He is still preparing. And when the moment he has appointed finally arrives, you will discover that the greatest obstacle was never the waiting itself. It was believing that the waiting could end. Yet with God, even the longest night eventually gives way to the dawn he has already prepared.